that's where I thought of you, and that's where I remembered Forsey.
Literacy is just a very, very unimportant topic. It has absolutely no bearing on the levels of success that individuals have to be able to
Not
succeed
at
in the
all.
world. It's
Not at all.
just um, and I love as well. I mean, having read that blog post that you've already put up, trying to just wrestle with and start to throw into the mix what are the assumptions that people hold about what literacy is.
Yeah.
I love the intention of this is to try to expand people's understanding of it,
Yeah.
and to really, maybe hopefully provoke people into I don't know, like a stronger understanding of what it is, and actually also a stronger understanding of why it's so important.
Exactly. That's exactly
And
right.
and I think that there's misconceptions around what it is that actually limit people's capacity to understand why it's just such an important thing to be able to know how to
Yeah.
develop.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And just that as well, that kind of the holistic definition, moving away from this notion that if you are not, competent at reading and writing, then you're not literate. Because, in this technologically saturated world, particularly that students are finding themselves in, these notions of critical literacy, and fake news and the impact of social media and algorithms on the kind of information students are presented with, social literacy, the digital literacy, like all of these facets of this topic that people just haven't even heard of, because literacy is reading and writing, and that's it. And that's the two things we want you to know how to do. So yeah, it would be wonderful if a person that came across it, read it, and thought, right, this is actually important. And I would love to know about, because we have university days, but sort of how did that journey bring you into Forsey, and what is your role within the organization?
Cool. So essentially, like you, I think we both have a thing in common, which is we like to follow the things that make us curious. Like, I think we actively kind of pursue those curiosities. And for me, the curiosity is that kind of later on towards the back end of our uni degree, I was exploring the different ways that schools function, and particularly how schools went from being places of really traditional kind of modes of learning to places that try to do things innovatively. And I was like, well, what's that process like? How does a school that, that sees itself as, an institution that skills and drills and chalks and talks and all that kind of stuff, how does it move from that place to a place of collaborative learning, of creative learning, whatever, and what are the sorts of challenges that present themselves? How do they navigate those challenges? Which essentially, I mean, it just so happened that I crossed paths with Miranda Jefferson, who's one of the co-founders of the organization. And at the time, she was actually someone working for the Catholic Education Office who was attempting to do that out of school.
Yeah, amazing.
And so long story, I went to London, I did some more research over there, and when I came back, the opportunity was kind of there to continue to explore these ideas and go, well, what is it about these four capabilities, the four C's: communication, collaboration, critical reflection, creativity, that enable change within organizations, whether that be schools, whether that be businesses, whatever. What is it about developing a culture that it's highly communicative, and that where people are effective at communication in the same way as collaboration, creativity? What is it about that enables those schools to then go and do really interesting, different sorts of things for their kids?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I arrived in the space, was kind of this weird classroom but research background. And I came into the space just working side by side with teachers to go, okay, well, how do we make sense of these ideas, not just from a policy system perspective, but actually what does it look like in the classroom, right? So if you're going to take these same concepts about why communication is so important, and we want, learners to have to develop these capabilities, well, how do you do that? because actually we aren't actually hugely literate as a profession around how do we develop skills in collaboration, or how do we develop skills in reflection or in creativity. And so I've just spent the last 5 or 6 years learning through teaching, learning through working with different schools. So our organisation, there's about 8 of us that work within it, and the way that we work is we actually just partner with schools that kind of identify that they're wanting to transform. They're wanting to do something profoundly different in the way that they teach in the classroom, in the way that they lead, in the way that they structure curriculum, etc. And then we partner with those schools over a course of time. And so there's some schools that we've been working with for 5 or 6 years. We don't kind of do one-off workshops because we just don't. They're not powerful enough. They don't have enough impact. And so, yeah, it's a pure co-construction collaboration with schools around what do they want to accomplish as a school, because every school's so different. We work in primary, we work in high school. What they want to achieve is so different. But how can a language around learning or a language around these 4 C's actually support your organization and actually developing them? And then in developing them, what can you achieve once you've got them?
It's fascinating, but particularly that notion of developing a language and like the power of communication. Have you felt like in your experience with the schools that you've been working with across this period of time, do you feel like it's more difficult for students to learn this new language that is embedded in the school culture, or is it harder for teachers to learn the ways of, I guess, embedding the language that they agree is going to be the change maker in the school?
Yeah, there's no, it's so different depending on the context, depending on the teacher. So like there is obviously a really big part of our work is, and I mean, this is by the way, my curiosity, I want to be upfront, wasn't in literacy, but the work that I've been doing has led me into a curiosity in literacy, because we've realized just how important it is to develop these capabilities. Because without a language to describe them, to identify them, you can't actually build them. You can't reflect on them to get better at them. And so so much of our work is just going, okay, well, here's a language that starts to communicate what you need in order to learn anything, right?
Yeah.
And so some of the challenges that arise for teachers, okay, and again, it's dependent on whether you're a high school teacher or a primary school teacher, but it's like, how do I navigate the fact that I might need to be teaching, science and a certain content set in science, but then now I also have to introduce this language and teach the meta language that's actually going to empower them to learn the science better, right? And so that tension of how different teachers, meet that challenge and wrestle with that challenge is different. So I mean, in primary schools, often the doing of that's it's a little bit more intuitive, because they're much more used to having to teach language. They're much more used to introducing vocabulary, which they can then they're much more practiced at going, well, how do we explore a concept like grit in relationship to learning through some quality literature? Let's introduce a picture book that explores grit. They're more practiced at being able to do that. But if you look at a high school setting and you're looking at a teacher that maybe isn't as practiced in that, then there's greater challenge for them to go, well, how do I go about that?
Yeah.
Right. So there's different challenges for different sorts of people in wherever they might be in their career, whichever context they're in, etc.
Definitely. And I suppose as well, it's kind of the blessing and the curse in high school of being, practiced in your discipline, and the way that you have taught that, or the way that your programs have suggested that you teach that in the school context that you've been a part of. And in some ways, relearning how to do that can be quite confronting. And I think, like we were just musing over how Zoom has totally, transformed so many things in education, but there were a lot of teachers, I think, that were sort of brought kicking and screaming into the kind of technological edge. Yeah, it's not a photocopy. I don't know the button.
Yeah.
But I suppose like that that feeling of being confronted that you don't know something as the person who's supposed to know everything is a challenge in and of itself. So but I want to sort of touch on that point there about communication, because it is one of the 4 C's. And I think when we think about literacy, or like when I think about it, I feel like communication is one of the words that's interchangeable for literacy. I don't immediately think reading, I don't think writing, because effectively the way that we communicate, whether it's the way that we communicate is multifaceted. You know, it's body language, it's the way that the tone of our voice, the pitch of our voice, the words that we use, the context in which we choose to use those words, right?
Yeah.
So I'm super curious about what role does communication play within these 4 C's? How's that kind of evolved in the work that you do?
It's such a really wonderfully formulated question, Renee, because I think that I want to attack a couple of things in it. I think firstly, the association between literacy and communication is totally, like, I would completely agree that your capacity to comprehend and read the world and then respond and express back in response to it, I think is hugely important. And, you know, like my little background here full of books is, you know, kind of intentionally kind of provocative, because I think it's not just your capacity to read a book, it's your capacity to read anything that can be read.
Yeah.
Right. So like you reading body language, there's a literacy around you reading yourself and the emotional literacy that comes along with that. There's a literacy about reading music, which is very, very different as well. But that fundamental thing in a class, just from a fundamental classroom perspective, communication and how it gets structured and what it looks like, feels like, sounds like, is so fundamental to developing literacy. So if you've got a classroom where you've got maybe 5 kids who are running the class because they're the ones who are confident to communicate their ideas, etc., you've got 5 learners practicing the building of those skills in literacy that other learners are not. Right, irrespective of, you know, their capacity or actual ability to read, write, read body language, etc., that just on that really fundamental baseline level is a way that we kind of talk about how you can give learners more opportunities to develop skills in whatever it is in learning, but literacy in particular, is how do you get learners and how do you structure the environment in a way that encourages and promotes active participation?
Yeah.
Right. And it is such a struggle. The research tells us that, you know, they followed high school classrooms, and they found it's like 5 or 6 kids are doing all the talking in all of the classrooms. So even before we get into what are the scaffolded ways that you teach writing, just on that really base level of voice or participation, how do you encourage learners to actually respond in learning? And I think that's a really, really big aspect of what it is that we try to do, is try to shift some of those dynamics, because, you know, we all, for whatever, and it's absolutely no one's fault that everyone was raised in cultures of learning whereby the teacher controlled who spoke, and that often, because of time pressure, because of how much content there is, that there's an efficiency in just getting people to throw their hands up, pick the people who know have the answer, and that way you feel like you can move the lesson along. You feel like there's a sense of, okay, I've got a couple of kids who are with me, great, I can kind of continue to carry through. But actually there's a weird inefficiency in it as well. Of course, because what you do is you actually leave a whole range of learners potentially behind, because there's not enough feedback around what's actually being learned. But also you're denying them opportunities in lots of ways to actually wrestle with the ideas, to actually wrestle with the concepts, to work with each other, to potentially learn them more deeply as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose as well, that kind of that notion of equality, and I guess in that, like lately I've been thinking a lot about like what's fair and what's equal. And, you know, in those spaces where,
just a tiny question, that one.
Yeah.
not deeply philosophical at all.
Just something that over a morning coffee, you know, as I'm looking out the window. And what you're sort of saying right now, really, it brings that question to the forefront of my mind. And in effect, I suppose that the kind of responsibility of teachers, in essence, really is to give everyone an opportunity. And I wonder whether that, those kind of pressures that you're talking about, things like time, things like curriculum, are main kind of drivers in a teacher putting that responsibility to the side and just saying, like, these are the things that are important. And
not even putting the responsibility to the side, but actually completely missing that it's their responsibility at all.
Yeah.
And I think that that's probably a bigger aspect, is that there's something quite misdirecting about a syllabus document.
Yeah.
Because what we find is that, and not, I mean, we're talking really, really general here, and there are obviously incredible educators who don't see it this way, but often a teacher's responsibility to meet syllabus outcomes comes before their responsibility to meet where their learners might be at.
Yeah.
Right, or what skills their learners might need to be developing at that particular moment in time. And I think this last couple of years has really thrown that into question, because teachers all of a sudden can't get through the content at a speed that they might be accustomed to. Yeah. They're having to get feedback in different sorts of ways, and probably are getting more authentic feedback around the fact that, actually, there are learners that take more time or need more time to process and learn the things that I might be teaching. So I think that's really, really, really come into play. But coming back to what you're talking about in terms of that responsibility to provide equal opportunity in the classroom, we talk about that. We've got a coherence maker, or like a framework that discusses communication, and it's called the communication crystal. And one of the processes that sits within the crystal is the enabling of voice. And when we say voice, we're not talking about just this. We're talking about, a response that might be visual. We're talking about a response that might be through body and through Tableau. That there's different ways for learners to express their understanding. But if they don't get those opportunities to express that understanding, just from a purely learning perspective, they actually don't get an opportunity to process, to learn that knowledge more deeply, because we actually know that it's through the expression and formulation of what you feel you understand or know at a particular point in time that you actually start to learn it more deeply. You writing a blog about literacy and having to formulate your ideas in that context helps you understand things at a level that's a level deeper than had you not had a blog and we're just curious and we're reading and talking to people.
That's exactly right. And there's two things that often come to mind, and I love that creativity is one of these 4 C's, because having worked with one of your colleagues, Jamie, back in the day when we were doing our drama ed, and Michael Anderson, huge fangirl. Drama pedagogy, I've always been a huge advocate of drama pedagogy as a way into helping students identify their own voice, but also that concept of authority, that as a student they are the author of everything that they do, that they are the kind of they are the core, and it kind of links back, I suppose, to the ETA's the word has escaped me, the ETA's conceptual framework. And one of the concepts in there being authority, and that in conjunction with audience. And I suppose like that dynamic of the teacher being the audience and the students having that authority to demonstrate what it is they know. That in and of itself, I feel is so important, right? Because isn't that really at the heart of literacy, that a student who is highly literate has the ability to kind of acknowledge that there is an audience, that there is a task, what the purpose of the task is, and they can kind of recreate it in a way that they deliver it so that it's understood by an audience.
I couldn't agree more. And I would almost extend on that and to actually argue that at all points in a classroom, some of the most profound teaching that I've seen is when, the teacher might not be conscious of this, but it's when simultaneously everyone in the room recognizes their role as co-author and audience all at the same time.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a really, really powerful thing to actually think about, that as a teacher, I'm not the authority, but I'm a co-author learning alongside other authors in their journey, in their wherever they're at this particular moment in time. And then it's actually through supporting each other in, the co-authoring of what's being spoken, said, created, and then and a responsibility to the to be audience in that space as well, and allow for space for people to be heard, to take stage, and to actually it's just such an incredibly important aspect to creating really strong quality learning environments where learners really are developing not just literacy skills, but skills in just deep learning skills.
Yeah.
I mean,
Definitely.
you said earlier, like, I think the question you asked was like, how, what relationship does communication have to the other C's?
Yep.
And it's just so fundamental. So, I mean, if you frame creativity through, the desire or responsibility to respond to the world and communicate to the world something in some sort of form or with some sort of medium, creativity is communication. I mean, if you think about working with others and collaborating, it is communicating with others and navigating relationships as you navigate towards the creation of something.
Yep.
If you're thinking about critical reflection, it's your capacity to think really deeply and to express new understandings, or to break apart assumptions, or wrestle with ideas with others. And so again, it's just communication sits at the heart of all of them. Without the capacity or confidence or competence to do that communication, you actually limit a learner's capacity to access the other C's.
Yeah, of course. They're woven, they're interwoven, and I suppose it would be incredibly hard to try and sort of put them in some sort of hierarchy because of their
connectedness.
Their connectedness. It's something you just said sort of made me curious, since we're on the kind of subtopic of curiosity here. In kind of your experiences over in London and back here working with schools in Australia, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot here, but I would love to know of an example of a school that you sort of saw at the start, something that a teacher might have done, or something that happened in a classroom, and the transformative moment and what that looked like. I'm fascinated to know sort of how that has been for you.
Yeah. So look, there's these little, I mean, in the relationship to, I mean, it happens everywhere all the time, actually, because one of our fundamental starting points is to start to orient teachers into thinking about, or just noticing, the kinds of dynamics that make up their classroom at the moment. So we might ask them to draw out, what do those dynamics look like? Who offers in the classroom, who takes a back seat, blah, 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 blah. And actually then we will just kind of offer up a strategy. And so there's a strategy that we have that every school that we work with kind of knows. It's like a really base level, really simple strategy, is that a teacher, instead of asking for kids to put their hands up to respond to a question, goes, let's get 4 people on the bus, right? And all that means is that from the class, 4 learners can self-nominate to actually stand up in the classroom, and they don't start talking the second they stand up. They wait until 3 other people or 4 other people, or however many you can play with the number that you choose, etc. And they just kind of wait and notice who else is wanting to speak. There's no order. The teacher doesn't go, okay, Irini, now you're going to go first, and then Dan, you're going to go second, etc. They navigate who chooses to jump on the bus first, second, third, fourth. And the only price you pay to get on the bus is to share some sort of insight. It could be that you're sharing something that you've noticed in an image that you've been looking at. It could be that you've just had a think, pair, share, and this is just the share component of it, right? And what they start to notice when they start to implement the strategy is just how surprising who stands up on the bus is, right? Because all of a sudden, you're leaving the responsibility up to people to take that initiative, to stand up and say, I actually want to speak. And what they inevitably come back and say to us is that it's like, that kid, I've never heard him speak before. But you know what, actually, I've got something I want to say here. right? And now the big question we always get is like, okay, so you take away hands, you don't do the hands up, don't you still get the same 5 kids that just pop back up on the bus every time? Don't you still get the dominant voices dominating? Well, actually, what you start to use the strategy as is to start to bring awareness to, well, who's already been on the bus and who hasn't, right? And so the class actually starts to co-regulate with one another. And the people who become dominant, who are more dominant voices in classrooms, you know, typically, they start to realize that maybe they're talking too much.
That's incredible.
You know, they start to realize that actually maybe they've got to make space for other people to actually voice something as well. And so there's different ways for you to manipulate a whole range of different strategies just to bring some alertness to the classroom around whose voices are we hearing. And coming back to your question around equalness, like equality and fairness, is it equal and is it fair? So is it more fair for us to be hearing from everyone at some point? And, you know, again, it's not to say that a perfect lesson is a lesson where everyone speaks once and
it's right, particularly critical literacy, because if the students can kind of regulate themselves in that moment where they think, I have something to say, but I want somebody else to contribute more than I think I need to contribute in this moment, that's a truly like life-changing lesson. You know, to be a human being that functions in a society with other human beings. And surely, you know, surely the syllabus can't be more important than that.
Look, I mean, we're singing from the same songbook at the moment. I mean, I just couldn't agree more. And I think that what's so important to remember about metacognition is that it needs language in order for you to be metacognitive.
That's right.
Right. So if you don't understand the concepts in which you are trying to be metacognitive about, then you can't be metacognitive.
That's right.
And so, you know, again, that's why the work that we do is around the learning disposition wheel or around the 4 C's. There being language attached to it, because what it does is it gives the community of learners, the classroom, the school, whatever, a way to speak together about whatever it is that you're wanting to talk about, right? And so if you're wanting to be self-regulating as a learner, well, what are you supposed to be self-regulating? Like, what are the things you're supposed to be self-regulating? Like, is it just meaning sit down, be compliant, and don't say anything unless you're asked? Or is self-regulation actually a much deeper thing? Is self-regulation participating in an incredibly noisy, busy environment, but still actually managing to navigate it without going, miss. Like, is it actually working through and navigating? And I think that's for me, one of the really key aspects about literacy is that just how significant of a navigation tool that it is.
Yeah.
And without this, what it gives you is the capacity to navigate the world. You can navigate so much if you're literate in a whole range of things. Now, if you're literate in learning, what that enables is kind of amazing. Like if you're, and we've had these stories of these kids who, I remember at a primary school, we had a 6-year-old say to us in a reflection after the teacher would do a reflection on the day and go, tell me a moment when you used one of these dispositions on the wheel. And this kid went, in numeracy this morning, I noticed that I was really struggling. And when I noticed that I was struggling, I went to go and distract my partner because I was struggling. But then I realized that the only reason I was distracting them was because I was finding it hard. So what I did was actually just focus, and then I tried to persist. And when I couldn't, I then asked my partner for help.
That's absolutely incredible. Not because I don't think that 6-year-olds are capable of that. They are very capable of that.
Yeah.
It's the process of that thought and the ability to articulate that's
right.
That
exactly. And so And so again, it's like if you are a teacher out there that's wanting to develop metacognition in your classroom, well, you actually have to develop a practice around reflection, because it's actually the only way into that metacognitive space is to think about your own thinking.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is that teachers, again, not some are, but some aren't practiced at allowing the time and space to reflect on the things that have been happening. Whether it's, we tried the learning in a different way today. How did it go? How did you find yourself in that? How did it feel to be in that particular moment? Because, and often, particularly in a secondary school setting, often the processes of reflection are more attached to certain subject areas and disciplines. It's more an intuitive part of the pedagogical process. But I mean, we would argue that it should be a really significant part of every area of learning, is reflecting on how are you going in that learning, because that's the only way that you can get better as a learner.
Yeah, so true. It's reflection is a totally undervalued tool, but also skill. And I feel like lockdown sort of forced humanity to reflect. And
well, you'd hope so.
All of the people I spoke to were like, oh, I've never thought this much about my life and all the things that I've done and where I'm going and what I'm doing, and I'm having a crisis. And I was like, it's actually probably a good thing that you have been forced to stop and assess, everything in relation to everything else. And I often students that are sort of halfway through year 11 starting to have that revelation that reflection is actually something that's quite beneficial for them to do. And it really should have started so much earlier in their schooling, because that reflection, as you said, like it's kind of that step into metacognition, and knowing more about themselves and why and how they do the things that they do is really the most integral step into going into adult life, where no one's going to kind of stand in front of them and be like, you've got to do this, this, and this. Like, they got to do it for themselves. So yeah, I love that 6-year-old has unlocked that.
Yeah, and I think that you've worded it perfectly. It is a tool that is available to us all to use at any point, but there's also skill in it, and there's practice in it, like there is in riding a bike, or learning how to use a paintbrush or whatever. Is that you get better at it the more that you do it. You get more efficient at it. You get more capable at reflecting on deeper ideas and connecting those ideas in that reflection. You get more practiced at being okay with reflecting about yourself. Because again, this is a huge barrier to why reflection doesn't happen in classrooms, is because often kids don't feel very comfortable reflecting about themselves in the context of things. They're not used to it. And it's not something that's part and parcel of the way that they've experienced schooling. And teachers find it, understandably, rightfully so, find it incredibly challenging to put learners in that position or in that place. But I guess the flip to that is to avoid it, is to limit all possible opportunity to develop that skill. And if we go, actually, reflection is a fundamental skill to being able to navigate life, to being able to become a better human being, full stop, that actually it's a really important thing for us to do. But I mean, we find as well that actually it's a skill that maybe some teachers don't possess in great capacity. It's actually a skill that they haven't practiced and therefore can't teach it, because they themselves don't necessarily know, how do I go about it? What processes help me in reflection? How can drawing help me reflect? How can writing poetry help me reflect? How can, just even talking to someone about something help me reflect?
It's it's totally underrated. Even just the 10-minute coffee break with a colleague to, after a particularly, and unfortunately in my experience anyway, I feel like a lot of teachers do it only after a difficult class, or after something hasn't gone well. They don't take those moments to kind of celebrate those really powerful moments where learning has happened, and why was that successful, and how can we kind of capitalize on that to give students more opportunities to do this thing that they, you know, have obviously kind of presented a competency in. And you the nail on the head there, that it is a practice, it is a tool, and it's something that I think all educators need to make more time for in some capacity.
Yeah, make more time for it and be open to seeing the possible power of it. If there's someone who might not be particularly confident at doing it now, or maybe they're not seeing why it's significant just yet. Just being open to the idea that through a shared reflection on something, through a reflection about how people might be feeling that day or whatever, that things are revealed that actually are hugely formative to their understanding of their classroom, right? And I think it's as a purely educational tool, separate to its profoundness in life, its capacity to provide formative feedback is unmatched.
Yeah.
Because you have so much more awareness about either how learners have experienced what you've offered to them in that lesson, and therefore how then you move them forward in whatever thing you choose to do next.
Yeah. Oh, goodness me. I'm full of ideas and inspiration and thoughts, and I can't wait to sort of collate all of this and, you know, spread the 4C magic into the ether, into the virtual ether. But this is a semicolon, because I totally want to pick up this conversation again.
Semicolons, that sounds great.
Semicolon. Thank you so much. This has been super insightful, to say the least.